Yeah, it's just me here tonight, I said as I washed up a few dishes. The darkness outside seemed held at bay by the big floodlight on the pole. The forest surrounding our little cabin looked like a green wave that was preparing to swallow our circle of humanity up forever. And it was only thanks to that 120-watt bulb that we were saved. I had the phone pressed against my ear, and I laughed as my boyfriend said something funny. The phone slipped towards the soapy water, and I caught it just in time as something scratched at the door again. What? Nah, they haven't come home yet. Uncle Ricky doesn't usually like to be out in the woods after dark. I opened the back door as another loud scratch came from it, and Benji walked in. The mutt had been with our family for years, and as he lumbered in, he wagged his tail and gave me a big doggy grin. I wrinkled my nose with disgust when I noticed that he'd been rolling in something. There was red-brown crust all over his right side, and at first I mistook it for blood. When I saw he wasn't limping, though, I figured it was just mud, or worse, blood off of some carcass he'd rolled around in the woods. I started after him as he made his way towards the laundry room where his food bowls were, my boyfriend prattling away in my ear. Rick, I'm gonna have to call you back, I said, making my way towards the laundry room before Benji could roll around on the clean laundry. Everything okay, babe? Yeah, but Benji rolled in something, and I don't want him to get it all over the house. Okay, well, stay safe. Love you. Love you too, Rick. See you tomorrow. I hung up the phone and took a step towards the laundry room. I had just reached for the bristle brush by the sink when my phone blared from the countertop. I turned away from Benji and walked towards the phone, checking the caller ID to see who it was. Brad's smiling face was plastered across the screen, and I picked it up on the third ring. I figured it would be them telling me they were on their way and running late. I didn't get 3 words out, however, before I was immediately buffeted by a wall of static and Brad's frantic voice yelling as he cut in and out. I held the phone a little away from my ear, like it might explode. Hello? Oh God, thank God, Rach. I need you to call the sheriff right now. His tone was equal parts terror and fury, and I was immediately worried. What happened? Is everything okay? Uncle Ricky's hurt pretty bad, and Dad's not in the best shape either. Dad says to call the sheriff and get an ambulance. Lock the door until we get there. Brad, what happened? Do it, Rachel. We'll be there in 5 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone until we get there. Then he hung up on me, and I was left looking at the silent brick. I tried the sheriff's office, but the phone just rang and rang before connecting me with static. The phone number for the ambulance did the same, and by this point, I was starting to get scared. Was there a problem with the phones in town? Had some disaster happened out in the woods that spilled over into town? As I went to lock the door, I saw the familiar headlights of Dad's old pickup coming up the driveway. I flung it open instead and went to help them. Dad came out of the back, hoisting Uncle Ricky under the arm, and Brad hopped out of the driver's seat and ran over to help him. Uncle Ricky hung limply between them, and I could see at a glance that he was not in good shape. His flannel shirt and jeans were covered in blood, and though it was hard to tell, I thought his left arm might be gone. Dad was covered in blood too, but it looked like some of it might be Uncle Rick's. He had 4 long claw marks running through his left eye, and it was swelling too badly for me to tell if the eye still worked. Brad shouted at me to get the door, and I complied as all 3 of them came running into the living room. In the light, it was easy to tell how bad Uncle Rick was. His arm was gone, the sleeve had been used to make a tourniquet around the stump, and his breathing was shallow as he lay on the couch in a state of unconsciousness. Brad said something about getting back for the guns, but Dad shut him down and sent us both to lock the doors. After the house was secure, Dad asked me if I'd called the sheriff or the ambulance. I told him about the strange static, and he swore loudly as he took his own cell phone out of his pocket. He dialed a number, and I could tell by his face that he was getting the same result. Finally, he swore and threw the phone against the wall. I guess we're on our own, he said, and it was the most hopeless sound I'd ever heard come out of my daddy. Even when Mama died, he'd still kept a strong face on for us. What's going on? What happened to Uncle Rick? I asked. Dad looked over at Brad, and after a silent conference, Dad started to tell it. We'd been hunting for most of the day. We hadn't caught a damn thing. Something was scaring the game off. We heard it walking around a few times and thought it was a bear. Your Uncle Rick said it smelled like a bear. So when the sun started going down, we decided it was time to pack it in. We started getting everything together. Right out of the blue, A doe steps out in the meadow. She looked around real skittish-like and starts cropping grass real quick. She clearly smelled whatever had been making that noise all day, but the deer has to eat, and she started filling her belly as quickly as she could. Your uncle sighted her up and dropped her real easy, and we figured at least we'd have one thing to show for our efforts. No sooner did we get to the edge of the meadow when a big old something comes crashing out. It grabbed our deer and bolted back into the woods like a bat out of hell. It kind of looked like a bear, I guess. The sun was setting and it was hard to tell, but it moved quicker than any bear I'd ever seen. Brad and I were just going to let it go, but Rick was mad as I'd ever seen him. He tore off after it, saying he was going to take that thing home instead. So we follow him, not wanting to leave him in the woods alone after dark, and we chased this thing into its cave. At that point, I was sure it was a bear, so we go creeping in, trying to surprise it. As the sun sets behind us, we see this thing hunkered over the deer, and it weren't no bear. It's wolfing at the deer, just slurping down big mouthfuls, and Rick gets real pale and starts gibbering about how it's the thing that we saw when we were kids. Wait, I interrupted, you've seen this thing before? Dad looked perturbed, but nodded. Yeah, that's why Rick hated to go into the woods after dark. When we were teenagers, we were up in a stand, hunting deer. Rick sights one before sunset, and he drops it, much like we had tonight. We're about to go get it when this big thing comes out of the woods and starts wolfing it down right there in the meadow. Well, you know your Uncle Rick. He always had a temper. So he pops off a shot at it. Hits it too, but that don't do nothing but piss it off. It comes roaring and charging up to the bottom of our tree and starts clawing and pushing until it topples it over. We jump out just as it hits the ground and just go tearing off running for the truck. And that was what you saw today? Well, Dad hedged, it was almost dark when we shot the deer, and we never got a good look at it. All I know is that's what chased us out of the woods, and Rick wouldn't go hunting with us for the next 3 years after that. He paused for a minute to make sure I was out of questions before continuing his story. So with Rick gibbering, this thing looks up and sees us. I swear to you that it came up on its hind legs and walked like a man as it ran at us. Rick pops a shot off, probably just panic fire, but it just shrugs it off and lands on him. I saw his arm, rifle and all, go into its mouth, and I heard it crunch as it bit it clean off. Rick starts screaming, and we all start yelling. Before it can finish him off, though, Brad and I pepper it 4 or 5 times with buckshot. It must have dazed it, because it rolled off of Rick with a loud shriek and stumbled back towards the cave. It sounded like a man screaming, Brad said, and Dad nodded before going on. It starts flailing around in pain, and we grabbed Rick and start dragging him back towards the truck. This thing came after us, and it sounded like it was crashing through the trees the whole way. We couldn't move very fast. Each of us had an arm under Rick as we drug him along, and I swear it would have had us if it hadn't been for Benji. My blood suddenly ran cold. Benji? Yeah, poor little guy. He's been with us the whole time. He didn't seem to want anything to do with that thing, but when it jumped on us again and raked my face, he started growling and lunges right at it. I hear them tearing and snarling at each other, and we just hightailed it back to the truck. It's a wonder we ever found it in the dark. Poor old Benji. He sacrificed himself so we could get away. Both Brad and my dad looked forlorn, but I just shook my head. No, he didn't. He's right here. Dad gave me a funny look. What are you talking about? He came wandering in not long before you guys did. That's when I remembered the blood on his fur. There was no way he could outrun the truck. Hell, the only reason I hadn't questioned it was because I had forgotten he had gone with him. I looked back towards the kitchen door, and it creaked open as Benji's friendly grin poked through the gap. He strolled into the living room, his fur still a mess of blood and mud, and glanced around the room as his tail wagged and his big old doggy smile stretched across his face. When he stepped up on his hind legs, I thought for sure I was dreaming. Benji leapt across the living room, and when he hit the couch, he was no longer the cuddly mutt we'd all come to love. He was 200 pounds of sleek black fur and raking claws that reduced my family to a spray of blood and screams of mercy. I fell back from the scene, covering my eyes with my hands to block it all out. I could still hear every bone-wrenching yank, every blood-splattering swipe, and every watery gurgle as my family had their throats torn out. I was numb. My mind shrank away from the scene before me as I backpedaled until my back hit the wall of the cabin. I curled my knees up to my chest and put my head against my knees as I sank to the floor and waited for it to be over. I didn't care at that moment whether I lived or died. I only wanted it to end. I could feel myself crying as the living room became a killing field. And when it finally ended, I could hear the overpowering bray of my explosive sobs. My sobs stopped when I heard heavy footsteps walking towards me. I didn't look up. I didn't want to look up. But when the creature's hot breath puffed against the top of my head, I pulled my face away from my knees despite myself. His blood-smeared face was inches from mine, and I quickly buried my face against my knees again. It was leaning over me, my family's blood pattering onto my skin, and it was all I could do not to pass out from terror. We stayed like that for several minutes, until I couldn't take it anymore. I lifted my head and looked at this semi-feline face and asked the question, Why haven't you killed me yet? His voice was high, like a bee that's been caught in a jar, and it hurt my ears to listen to him. Because you helped me. For that favor, I will give you a favor in return. Leave my woods before sunset tomorrow, and I will allow you to continue to exist. Stay, and you will share the fate of your kin. Then he turned and walked out of the house on two legs. I was gone before the sun came up. I threw my clothes in a bag, took the pickup my brother had been careless enough to leave the keys in, and drove. My phone rang a few times, but I ignored it. The hardest was when Aunt Clara called, but after 3 days, even she stopped calling. They likely assumed I was dead too. I sold the truck before I left the state, and haven't looked back. I drove until I couldn't see the forest anymore. I drove until I couldn't see 3 trees grouped close enough to obscure anything. And when the desert stretched out before me, I finally stopped. I'll make my life here now. I have no intention of ever leaving the desert again. I don't know what forest this creature calls its own, and I never want to find out. Good evening, my little creeperonis. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's reading. If you'd like to support the show, we've got a Patreon going on. $5 patrons have their names read out at the end of every video, so if you'd like to be the first one, follow that link and be a Patreon supporter. Or you could always buy one of my books. I'll leave a link to my latest on Amazon, Dark Journeys. And as always, we thank you for your patronage, and we thank you for stopping by. This is Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful